Medieval towns. Picture yourself and a friend walking happily down a street in a town of medieval times. Together, you are discussing plans for the evening, and neither of you has any idea of the catastrophe that is about to unfold. As you round a corner, you hear a shrill voice coming from the window of a house 6 stories above the street. The voice belongs to a lady issuing a warning that roughly translates into, "Look out below!" Before you can take evasive action, you are suddenly drenched with a bucket of gooey garbage. Your nose tells you it is a mixture of black pudding, beans, and the remains of eels the family on the 6th floor had for dinner. Do you angrily make your way up to the room from whence came the garbage and express your displeasure? Do you threaten to punch the lady's husband in the nose? Of course not. You brush yourself off as best as you can and you go on your way. If anyone is to be scolded, it is you for not having jumped out of the way quickly enough. Garbage, and worse, being thrown into the street was a common practice in medieval towns. Even birth and rank held no privilege when it came to being hit with something unpleasant. No less a person than King Louis IX of France was himself doused with the contents of a chamber pot when strolling along Paris one fine day. Remember, a chamber pot is where people used to put a pot in their rooms and they would pee and poop in it. In the absence of any kind of sanitation service, people did the natural thing and tossed their waste wherever it might fall. Had they realized the health threats involved, they surely would have acted differently. As it was, they relied on pigs and other animals that roamed free to take the place of the present-day garbage truck. Sometimes a particular hard rain would help by washing away some of the refuse. It is only natural that under such unsanitary conditions, disease would run rampant. Epidemics that took the lives of large populations of medieval villages and towns were common. One such epidemic of the bubonic plague in the 14th century wiped out not only the entire towns, but possibly a third of the population of Europe. That was the dreaded Black Death that appeared in Europe in the year 1347. So over here, this caption says, "A priest prays for victims of the plague. Those who became ill often died within hours." Bubonic plague is a disease transmitted to humans by fleas from rats. When the disease appears today anywhere in the world, it can quickly be brought under control. During the Middle Ages, however, neither the nature of the disease nor the treatment for it were known. When it struck, its victims died almost immediately. Many people went to bed perfectly healthy and died before the sun rose the next day. The term Black Death came from the fact that black spots appeared on the bodies of all who contracted it. Before it ran its course, the disease took the lives of some 50 million people. The series of plagues that swept through Europe actually played a role in weakening feudalism. The dramatic population decline led to a severe labor shortage, making serfs' and peasants' labor more valuable. Therefore, they were able to negotiate more rights and better conditions from their lords. In addition, the population of towns recovered more rapidly, so towns became more important than feudal estates. Although towns in the Middle Ages were dirty, unsafe, and dangerous, they represented a step forward from the instability of the Dark Ages. The uncertainty of feudal life caused people to seek safety either near the castle of a powerful lord or on the grounds of some remote monastery. This need for safety actually led to the reappearance of towns. As more and more people gathered around places that could afford them protection, castle and monastery grounds began to take on the appearance of villages. In time, these villages became towns. As these towns grew in population and prospered, many were able to buy their freedom from the feudal lord who controlled them. Others won their independence through armed uprisings. A dramatic increase in population in the 12th century also led to more urbanizations. More towns appeared as travel became safer and trade increased. Some towns sprang up at crossroads, where traders and merchants came and went. Others developed near rivers or along seacoasts. Some towns, such as Paris, France, and Florence, Italy, were quite large. Most, however, averaged between 5 and 10,000 people in a population. Towns that developed while national governments were weak and conditions were still unstable had high walls for protection. It was the presence of such walls that made medieval towns crowded. With only so much ground space available, it was necessary to construct buildings as high as 6 and 7 stories. As each story was added, the builder extended it outward somewhat over the street to make it larger. By the time the building reached the 6th or 7th level, the occupant on the top floor could literally reach out and touch the building across the street. How's that for a close neighbor? It was this closeness of the building that made fire an ever-present threat. Because more structures under the Renaissance period were built of wood, fire spread quickly once it started. Some towns were partially or totally destroyed by a fire a number of times. London burned 4 times in the 12th century, and Rouen, France, the city where the Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in 1431, was totally consumed 6 times between 1200 and 1225. Later, when stone was used for construction and fire brigades were introduced, the number of fires were reduced dramatically. Appearance-wise, medieval towns were generally laid out in the same way. In the center was a large open area, variously referred to as the square, a place, or a piazza. If the town was very large, the square might also be the location of a cathedral. Town squares were hubs of activity where tradesmen and merchants set up stalls and conducted business. Sometimes strolling actors drew crowds as they performed a play for all who would stop and listen. So too did jugglers, tumblers, and clowns. Between 8 and 9 p.m., the curfew bell rang, and most citizens retired for the night behind the safety of their doors. Streets were dark and danger ever present, and there were few policemen to guarantee the safety of any person who dared to venture out. Those who did were required to carry a light and have a good reason to be outside. Who were the inhabitants of these early towns? Most were members of a new middle class of merchants, traders, and craftsmen referred to as the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is the French term meaning town dweller. In the German language, the term becomes, I'm not going to say this correctly, bourgeois or burger. A free town with the right of self-government was called a borough, or in German, Burg. You are probably beginning to see the influence on America by now. What about Pittsburgh and Harrisburg and Hamburger? Supposedly, immigrants from the German city of Hamburg brought that American favorite with them when they arrived in the 1800s. The merchants and craftsmen monopolized business within the walls of the city. They formed guilds, which in some ways resembled early labor unions. Membership in the appropriate guild was mandatory for all merchants and craftsmen. A young man had to pass through a training stage, becoming a full-fledged member. First, beginning about the age 7, a boy desiring to learn a trade was apprenticed to a master craftsman. When he acquired the skills to earn a living, he became a journeyman. As such, he could then work for anyone who would hire him. If he wanted to become a master craftsman and own his own shop, he had to pass a strict exam, supervised by leading members of the guild. This involved creating a masterpiece of work showing that he had mastered this particular skill. Merchant and craft guilds became increasingly powerful through the Middle Ages as towns grew. Whereas knights lived for war, peace, and stability were in the best interest of traders and craftsmen who wanted to conduct a profitable business. Therefore, towns, guilds often supported the king against troublemaking nobles, further weakening the feudal system. Now you can look over at this picture and it says a guild master judging the skills of 2 journeymen. Most of the other inhabitants of medieval cities were laborers who took any job they could find. These included serfs who had either run away from the manor or had been granted their freedom. Each town had its share of beggars and thieves, both whom preyed on the local citizenry. With streets so crowded that, and so many people about, a fast thief with an even faster knife could cut a purse away from a belt in record time and be gone in a flash. Towns did their best to encourage or discourage such lawbreakers, even leaving executed criminals hanging from the gallows indefinitely. Paris, for example, always had 24 bodies swinging at the end of the ropes for all to see. The message to passerby was simple: behave yourself while in our town or face the consequences. Such was life in typical towns of the Middle Ages.